Obviously, when you were competing, you weren't competing in a co-ed situation.
Right.
It was women competing against women and men competing against men. And it's been set up like that for a long time. So given the claims in our society for radical equality, both in actuality and as a desirable outcome, first of all, do you think that what is, if any, the justification for not making all sporting events, let's say, radically co-ed?
Well, because I think we know how this would turn out. Time and time again, regardless of the sport, regardless of if it's an individual sport, a team sport, what that might look like. We've seen example after example where a mediocre male or mediocre men's team, nowhere near ranking the top. Let's say this could be nationally, this could be whatever level you're comparing here. Unanimously, these men's teams, they dominate the women. So having a co-ed team, that would not be beneficial to women by any means. So I think that's why I believe there's value to having co-ed instructional teams when you're younger, when you're learning. But once you've gone through that puberty, it's irreversible. Men are, of course, on average, taller, faster, stronger, more powerful. They jump higher. There's so many different attributes, advantages that men have in comparison to women. And so I think co-ed teams, in a sense, if that's what you're looking for, of course, there's value to it. But at the competitive level where you're competing, again, to win, that's what your goal is. Having men compete against women is very obvious. It's unfair.
Okay, so let me push this. I'm going to push this as far as I can push it, because things are being pushed in our culture as far as they can be pushed. So we might as well go in for a penny and in for a pound. I could say, well, why don't we just scrap women's sports altogether? Like, if the goal is faster, stronger, better, more powerful, and on average, that's not happening in the female domain, why don't we just give up the entire enterprise on the female sports end and just let the men take over the playing field? If that's the point, if the point is to foster the highest possible level of performance. So to
say that men are stronger, to say that men are faster, taller, whatever, that's not to say that women are inferior. That's not to say that we're not capable of amazing things and we're not strong and we're not, again, all of those words I previously mentioned, but we have different physical ceilings. I believe we deserve to be celebrated on our uniqueness. That's what makes the women's sporting category special. And there are still phenoms in women's sports, just like there are male sports. Look at Venus and Serena Williams. While by no means could they compete with the best male tennis player, they're phenomenal. They are, it's amazing what they've accomplished. They've set themselves apart from every other female in the world, and that deserves to be recognized. So we're different.
So let's delve into that. So, because you might say, well, there's two reasons for high level competition, and let's say on the athletic front, one would be to extend the domain of what's possible in terms of performance and to model that for other people. And then you could make a case, you could make the case that the absolute records are the best example of that. So the fastest person in the world, the fastest swimmer in the world, and most of the time that's going to be men. But then you could make a more sophisticated case, which I believe is the proper case, that actually what you're doing as an athlete or as any expert in a competitive realm is modeling the ability to push the envelope and to further transform and develop. And unless you believe that that's less important for women, which is a preposterous thing to believe, then you have to believe that setting up a situation where women can push the envelope consistently in whatever directions they're pushing, you have to presume that that's a psychological good and a social good. And then you have to presume that the spaces where that can occur have to be protected. But that also opens a can of worms, doesn't it, Because since the 1960s in particular, we've blown off the barriers between men and women in terms of general participation in society. right? And so we've decided that all things considered, spaces isolated to a given sex are suboptimal, right? The schools are co-ed, the public schools, the universities are co-ed, all business enterprises are co-ed, so to speak. And then, of course, so that raises the question, well, should any domains be left sex segregated? If so, how do you walk the fine line between sex segregation for the purpose of facilitating development and sex segregation that turns into prejudice and oppression, right? Just rejection on the basis of sex. And then also the thorny question of, well, if most enterprises should be completely open to both sexes, which enterprises should be protected? Do you have any? Obviously, you believe that athletic performance, athletic competition per se, should be one of those protected categories. But do you have any sense of how we as a society should draw the line? It's like, are there spaces that should be male only? Like, one of the things I really wonder about, for example, I talked to Tulsi Gabbard about this a while back, is like, it isn't obvious to me at all that our society would benefit by having women in frontline combat.
Right.
Like, and it isn't that I can generate an immediate coherent argument for why I believe that. There's something about it that strikes me more deeply and emotionally, I suppose, there's something preposterous about that. Maybe it's partly because, look, it isn't obvious to me that professional frontline combat, that's pretty damn hard on anyone. That's even really hard on extremely well put together and extraordinarily strong and brave men. And so to also presume that that's going to be open to women just seems to me to be taking the whole bloody charade too far. Now, you could say, well, that I'm old-fashioned and prejudiced, although I don't actually think I'm either. But, it is a thorny question, right? It's like, well, if men and women are equal, then why should there ever be sex-segregated spaces of any sort? And we're certainly seeing that on the bathroom front. We're seeing that on the change room front. We're seeing that on the athletic front. So where do you think that the line should be drawn so that there are female spaces and male spaces and that those are protected? And how do you think we manage that, like, legally and conceptually?
I think where any place where either of the sexes is vulnerable, whether that be in regards to privacy, in regards to safety, in regards to anything that relies on your physiology, because of course men and women are physiologically different. I think that's where that sex protection based rights are important. So prisons, that's an area where women specifically are vulnerable. Of course, shelters, again, bathrooms, locker rooms. No woman should be subjected to having a male in that space. So I think it's areas where sex is important.
So it's something like there's a subset of areas where the fact of the biological difference between men and women becomes paramount.
Correct.
Right? And so those would be, well, in change rooms is a really good example of that. But you extended that also to, say, women's shelters and prisons and so forth. So there's something there that's sort of, what would you say? It's reminiscent of the idea of nakedness, I suppose, because you mentioned vulnerability, right? So when you're stripped down to your most vulnerable, that's when the segregation is most necessary. It's something like that, right?
I believe it
seems that way.
Yeah, I believe there's value in understanding that. I truthfully think anywhere where sex is relevant, there are certain places. Let's consider the workplace. There are certain places where sex isn't necessarily relevant. There are certain places where it are. I like how you mentioned military. That's a very good point. Men and women, there are differences there that would, again, make anything that requires sheer strength, make men be advantageous and make that more achievable. That's what we're wanting, right? We want to be this powerhouse. We want men at the forefront. So I think where sex plays a role, that's where we kind of have to draw that line. There are certain...
So it would be where the biological differences are germane, number one, to performance, like specifically germane to performance, but also number two, specifically germane to differential vulnerability. So anywhere where women are sexually vulnerable, or anywhere where the physical differences in performance actually have a substantive effect on the performance itself. So here's an example. I mean, there's no evidence that men and women differ in IQ. There are micro differences in IQ, and some of them are arguably important in some micro domains. But overall, the evidence is quite clear that on average, men and women have the same level of intelligence. And so then we might presume that in any domain where intelligence is the fundamental marker of potential merit, there should be no sex segregation. But if we're looking at something like, let's say, military battlefield rescue, that might be a good one, where physical strength and becomes a paramount marker of the actual ability to do the job, then sex-based discrimination starts to become appropriate and morally required. And then you could make the reverse case, which is, well, where women are particularly vulnerable on the sexual front, so that would be in locker rooms, for example, that's also a place where sex segregation is reasonable. So those are the basic rules, something like that.
Not just is it appropriate and morally responsible, it's beneficial. It's something that is good for the greater good of society in general. So yeah, I agree.